Okay, welcome to this seminar. I'm very happy to see such a qualified group of audience together with the panel. I think this promises for a good debate. My name is Gina Lende, and I'm the coordinator of the Religion Research Group at PRIO. The seminar today is part of a series that we will host during the year. Here we will investigate religion both thematically and empirically. Thematically, we will look at religious leaders in peace building, which is today's topic. And we will also, in the course of the year, look at the following topics. We will investigate the role of religious texts. We ask, do religious texts motivate action? Another seminar will focus on the definition of religious conflict. We ask if conflicts really are more religiously charged today, and if they are, does that make conflicts different than they have been in the past? Thirdly, we investigate the role of religious and secular martyrdom in their violent and non-violent forms. In addition, we will have case-related seminars, and we will look specifically at 3 countries. In relation to Pakistan, we will address the role of Islamic charities and peace building. In Sudan, we will look at the increased politicization of religion, and we ask how this situation affects the religious actors and their opportunity to become involved. Turning to Nigeria, we address the issue of increased religious-related tension, with a specific focus on the role of responses from the Christian, specifically Pentecostal communities. I hope I will see many of you also in the following seminars. You will now all be part of our emailing list. I also hope that an additional fruit of these seminars will be to stimulate academic cooperation on these topics. I'm now very pleased to introduce Tale Steen Johnsen, who is responsible for today's seminar. She's a former PRIO colleague, and she's also part of the religion network at PRIO. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Agder, where she studies interfaith initiatives in Ethiopia. In addition to her strong academic interest, she also has considerable experience in the field as a senior advisor at the Norwegian Church Aid, where she for several years have worked with interfaith initiatives in the African Great Lakes region. The chair is, in other words, very well qualified in addressing today's topic.
Thank you, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Yeah, loud and clear. So, the past decade, religious leaders have gained attention as important actors in peace building. It has been generally assumed that their position at the top of broad religious communities have opened opportunities to mobilize significant constituencies for peace. And gathering leaders from different faiths together has been launched as a powerful symbol of coexistence, which might impact on people's view along the lines as, if the religious leaders can stand together, why can't we? But we ask, is it that simple? Does the position of a religious leader necessarily open for a powerful contribution to peace? What do we need to know about religious leaders and the kind of role they can play? And what is the significance of context for this role? Or to put it in the words of this seminar, how do we know that the religious leaders not only talk the talk, but are also able to walk the walk? This seminar does not aim at disqualifying religious leaders as actors for peace. But what we want, however, is to participate in an increasing internationally debate, a critical debate on this topic. Frankly speaking, we want to learn more about this. And today, I must say, we have gathered a very interesting panel which holds both broad academic and practical experience on this topic. And this panel, myself included, will be able to draw upon field experience from Norway, the Balkans, Sri Lanka and Ethiopia when discussing religious leaders and peace. And the panel participants were also chosen based upon the numerous very interesting debates I seem to have with them whenever I meet with them. So they are very skilled and knowledgeable and opinionated people on this topic. Susan Hayward at the end. She's our keynote speaker today. She has traveled all the way from Washington and the United States Institute of Peace to talk to us. And in her work, she specializes in the role of religious leaders and communities in motivating both violence and peace processes. She holds a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School and the Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. Her recent work has focused on religious dynamics in conflicts in Sri Lanka, northern Uganda, and more recently, Colombia. The reason why we wanted to ask Susan to come to talk about this topic is that we met her here at PRIO 1.5 years ago, and we had a very good and interesting discussion about this topic. So we wanted to hear more from her and talk to her. Ingrid Vik, number 2 there. She's a special advisor at the Oslo Center for Human Rights. She holds a master's degree in history of religion and has done research on the role of religious leaders in peace building in the Balkans. An important point is that her experience has been the leader of the Nansen Dialogue Center and been working strategically on learning, implementing, and evaluating effects of dialogue in a conflict setting. And currently, Ingrid is leading a project on the role of religion in development, commissioned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Shoaib Sultan, he is a special advisor at the Norwegian Center Against Racism. He's an active writer and commentator on Norwegian religion, integration and dialogue in the Norwegian setting. He holds a master's degree in business administration and is also the former General Secretary of the Islamic Council of Norway. And Iselin Jørgensen, she holds a PhD in history of religion from the University of Oslo. Oh, sorry, Frimlund, sorry. She holds a PhD in history of religion from the University of Oslo on Buddhism and violence during the Sri Lankan Civil War. She's been a researcher at PRIO here, where she, among other things, mapped and analyzed different political positions among Buddhist monks towards Norwegian facilitated peace process. She's currently working as a senior advisor in the Research Council of Norway in the Division of Science. So, before we give the floor to Susan, I would like to notify that this seminar is being filmed, like seminars are these days at PRIO, so that you just are aware of that. Susan, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to thank PRIO for inviting me to participate in this discussion and for all of you for coming out. It's always very exciting for a peace studies geek like myself to be in Oslo, which has been home to the development of so much of the transformative and foundational peace theory and practice over the years, and an example of government engagement to support peace building around the world. It's great to be here and to be having this conversation with all of you. So with that said, we'll commence. I don't know about here in Norway, but in the United States, the chorus reached its fevered pitch in September 2001. That's when the conversation about religion, conflict, and peace shifted measurably, perhaps even irrevocably, in Washington. Until September 11th, 2001, a small but vocal group spilled a great deal of ink, arguing that US foreign policy needed to recognize that though diplomacy operated with an assumption of the separation of religion and politics into public and private spheres, the reality was that the boundaries of these two spheres was very porous. In much of the world, religious dynamics driving conflict could not be completely disentangled from political and economic issues at the hearts of these conflicts. In places like Israel and Palestine, the Balkans, and Sri Lanka, religious ideas and actors were influential, and social scientific evidence, meanwhile, was mounting that religion's influence was not only rising as a factor in conflicts, but its influence was heightening more generally as a force in the public sector around the world. As such, building sustainable peace or reconciliation would necessitate engaging religious ideas and actors rather than sidelining them, as the secular bias within the diplomatic sphere had been doing in the past, which had tended not to wane but rather to wax their influence in public sectors. On September 11th, everything changed. Suddenly, the diplomatic sphere in the United States acknowledged it could no longer afford to simply ignore or to dismiss religion, and that it had a lot of catch-up work to better understand it and to better understand how to engage it constructively. I've read that former Minister Eric Solheim, like former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, has stated the need for those in the Norwegian diplomatic sector to better understand religion, to engage it more constructively. I know Norwegian diplomats sought to engage the religious sector in Sri Lanka while facilitating its peace process. But perhaps, like in the States, there are fears that have prevented rigorous religious engagement in the past, fears about inflaming religious passions or about causing offense. Perhaps these fears persist. In the States, the argument has often been religion is a can of worms, is the phrase we use. And there's a potential that if you begin to engage it, you could make matters worse. Or perhaps there remains a healthy skepticism about the appropriateness of diplomats engaging religion at all, or about whether the religious sector can have a real impact in ending violent conflict, particularly with respect to transforming some of the structural issues, economic and political issues that are at the heart of conflicts. The title given for this symposium certainly reflects this skepticism. Surely not all engagement of religious leadership in peace building, even if well-intentioned, has been effective over the past decade. Now, I've been tasked by the organizers of today's symposium to launch a critical debate about religious leaders' engagement in peace building. So for sake of launching this debate, I'm going to put forward my argument. First, I take as a given that religious leaders, ideas, and institutions have driven conflict and disrupted peace processes around the world, that they have been spoilers to peace building. I nonetheless believe that religious leaders and faith-based organizations have also played important roles in peace building around the world, and that they must continue to do so. This is in large part to counter religion's contribution to driving conflict, but it's also because religious actors are natural allies in many of the issues constitutive of creating a holistic, positive peace, to use the words of Johan Galtung. And they play a unique and influential role in most societies, shaping attitudes and behaviors, directing persuasive ideas and significant resources towards issues relevant to social well-being, and includes development and justice. That being said, more is needed to develop sophisticated approaches to religious peace building, which, as an emerging field over this past decade, has suffered, I believe, from underdeveloped strategies and has lacked integration within the larger field of peace building. And I think this has weakened the efforts of religious peace building over the past decade. So I'm going to get to that. But before I flesh out this argument, I want to start with a few examples that I think illustrate the positive and real impact that religious peace building and institutions have played. So first, let's travel to Colombia, where a protracted conflict has raged over 60 years. In Colombia, religion has not been a driver of the conflict as such, but the Catholic Church, to whom 90% of the Colombian population belongs, is a very powerful actor in Colombia, a political actor, a social actor, even an economic actor. Over recent decades, bishops, nuns, priests, and lay people working through local churches and Catholic organizations have become increasingly involved in peace building. First in a piecemeal effort, local initiatives that were launched through local churches to respond to local issues, but increasingly as sort of a systematized strategic approach by the church. Various Protestant communities, particularly the Mennonite Central Committee, have also advanced peace and reconciliation through local Protestant churches. These actors in their work have used their social position, their moral authority, and their non-threatening status to mediate directly with armed actors in local areas in order to create zones of peace, zones of nonviolence that protect local communities. They've used their position to advocate for justice and human rights, mobilizing communities to its cause, documenting abuses of human rights, and bringing those abuses to court on behalf of victims. and they have served as accompaniment to defenders of human rights and to peace builders. They have advocated for sustainable development, and not just advocated for sustainable development, they've actually implemented and driven sustainable development projects that has served world poor, and in that sense has sought to address one of the root drivers of Colombia's conflict. The church has even directly facilitated formal negotiations between armed groups and the government, and this played a role in dismantling the paramilitary groups. This religious peace-building work extends throughout the country, including, importantly, areas of the country that the government and international organizations don't have reach, are unable to reach, areas that are controlled by guerrilla groups or other armed groups, areas where infrastructure is weak, and yet churches persist. Churches have infrastructure there and an ability to network people, to provide humanitarian relief, to respond to abuses of violence there. And they do this at a great deal of risk for individual religious actors too. Many of them have been killed in this work, but they persist. Next to Nigeria, where, as opposed to Colombia, religion has been a driver of the conflict between Muslims and Christians. Our partners there, we work with U.S. Institute of Peace, Religion, and Peacemaking Program, who I know PRIO hosted last year, are a Pentecostal pastor and imam team of interfaith mediators. Both men, their names are James and Ashafa, both men were leaders of religious militancy movements in their youth, but they subsequently reconciled with one another and then became engaged in promoting interfaith reconciliation in Kaduna, home to some of the bloodiest of Nigeria's Christian-Muslim violence. They've been trained in conflict resolution theory and practice, but they have incorporated Christian, Muslim, and indigenous African elements to create a methodology that resonates, that works within their local context. They've moved beyond interfaith dialogue, although that's an important element of their work, and have created mechanisms to train teams of religious actors who are able to proactively and successfully intervene at moments when interreligious tensions are heightened and threaten to erupt into violence. And they've been savvy about using the media in order to amplify messages from religious leaders that urge restraint and reaction to religious provocation by militancy groups. Importantly, they also engage youth in their work, who often feel marginalized from elite peace building and who are often those conscripted for violent purposes, convinced that the use of the sword is the best way to defend their faith. James and Ashafa work locally, particularly in their home of Kaduna State. In Yelwa, which has been home to a great deal of religious violence, they helped broker a peace agreement that has withstood the eruption of religious violence in neighboring states. Meanwhile, on a national level, the Nigerian Interreligious Council, which is comprised of high-level leaders, regularly conveys messages supporting religious coexistence and condemning religious violence. While these efforts have been unable to fully end Nigeria's conflicts, and I don't think it would be fair to say one civil society sector is responsible for fully ending a conflict, they have shown demonstrable impact in bridging divides between faith communities and in reducing religious violences, instances of religious violence locally. And their efforts to bridge the relationships between communities and to try to counter some of the religious narratives that propel and legitimate violence has also created relationships between people in the different faith communities that makes them more impervious to being mobilized across these identity fault lines by political actors or other religious actors who are motivating violence. There are more examples of the Bishop Ulama Conference in the Philippines, or of Sister Marie Bernard Lima in the DRC, who's led the Catholic Church's efforts to combat sexual-based violence, of the lay Catholic organization San Egidio, who in Mozambique and other places, Burundi, Uganda, have helped facilitate talks that led to negotiated peace deals, or Catholic and Lutheran religious leaders who did the same in Guatemala, as I know many of you are well aware, some Norwegians were involved in that. In South Africa and Guatemala, religious leaders and institutions helped frame reconciliation and orchestrated truth commissions, or consider the role of socially engaged Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and the mobilization of monks in Myanmar in 2007, or in Cambodia in the 90s, to put pressure on political leaders to respond to the suffering of the people and to advance reform. Or even Nobel Peace Prize winner Lema Gbowe in Liberia and her network of Muslim and Christian women that forced armed actors to negotiate. All these examples illustrate how religious leaders have used their unique social position to advocate nonviolently for peace and justice, to foster reconciliation and religious coexistence, to strengthen moral compulsion for peace, to link community needs to decision makers, to provide infrastructure for mobilization and assistance in places where the state and international agencies cannot reach. And there are more examples out there. I mean, I could go on ad nauseum, but I won't, because I don't want to be accused of painting a rosy picture and failing to get beyond the nice words about religion and peace building. So instead, let me put forward a few points of critique about some of the limitations of current religious peace building work and initiatives that have been led by the international community, and how I believe outside actors interested in strengthening and supporting religious peace building can help make this work more effective. My first point, religious peace building must go beyond engagement of senior religious leaders. There are many compelling reasons to engage senior religious clerics. They control institutional resources. They're often the gatekeepers to religious communities and will be able to affect whether other religious leaders and actors can be engaged in peace building. Particularly in hierarchical traditions like Catholicism or Shia Islam, they are influential in shaping their followers' religious attitudes and behaviors. Yet in various contexts, including Iraq, the Balkans, and Israel-Palestine, experience has shown that they're often constrained politically and socially by their highly visible position at the top of institutions. As a result, they may not be able to engage in initiatives that are deemed risky, and if they do so, they'll feel compelled to stick with the party line. They usually have very little time to implement the declarations for peace they make in international forums. And they're not as well connected to local communities, and so unable to speak as effectively to local needs and dynamics. I think this becomes especially true as religious leaders spend more time operating regionally and internationally, going to various conferences and so on, which often makes them less effective in their home communities. Moreover, the tendency of the international community to target traditional, ordained, formal religious leaders comes at the expense of non-ordained leaders, such as women and youth, who play important roles in shaping religious attitudes and behaviors in conflict zones. Engaging religion should not come at the expense of advancing UN Security Resolution 1325, which calls for women's equal participation in peace building. Rather, we have to think about engaging a broad array of religious actors throughout the hierarchy, religious actors both lay and ordained. In our work with WSIP, we've found that it's the middle range religious leaders, those who are not at the top of their institutions, but who are very influential in the local level, who are the best situated for sustained ground level track 2 peace building work. And James and Ashafan are an example of this. My second point, the specific roles that religious leaders can play in peace building depends on the degree to which religious issues are driving the conflict. So whether a conflict has religious drivers, I think, determines the specific role that the leaders can play in peace building. For example, it appears that religious leaders are less able to serve as third-party mediators or interveners in contexts where religion is driving conflict. In those places where religious actors have served roles in facilitating meetings and discussions between armed actors that led to peace agreements, so in Mozambique or Colombia or Guatemala, for example, this has tended to be environments where they are perceived as neutral actors who've been operating for a long time in local communities, who have the trust of various groups within those contexts, and who, in that sense, are seen as being committed to peace for peace's sake. They don't have specific issues that they're sort of political issues that they're advocating for in peace processes, or they're not identified with one group or the other in the negotiations. While religious leaders may not be as effective as mediators in conflicts with religious drivers, it is in these settings that religious leaders, institutions, and ideas have a crucial role to play in challenging religious narratives in support of violence and in forging relationships across religious divides. Here, religious leaders can play roles as social advocates, conciliators between groups, and public educators in track 2 peace building. With respect to formal peace processes, I think it's also vital to find mechanisms for engaging religious actors in these processes in places where they see that there are religious interests at stake, where they see themselves as stakeholders to the process. So for example, in Israel, Palestine, or in Sri Lanka, where there were issues of access to sacred space that religious leaders felt they were invested in the peace process. But when there were not mechanisms for them to be able to bring those interests and those needs to the process, they were more likely to become spoilers of the process and to mobilize public opposition to those processes that disrupted them. Point 3, both interfaith work, or work between religious traditions, and intra-faith work, work within religious traditions, is important and is necessary. Many of the religious peace-building efforts advanced by the international community over the past decade have been interfaith in nature. I think interfaith engagement is vitally important to advance peaceful religious coexistence, to advance religious freedom, particularly where conflict divides are across religious divides, or in places where there's exclusionary forms of religious nationalism that justify the marginalization of particular groups from political processes. Where there's sustainable, engaged, deep religious coexistence, religious violence is less tenable, or if there are instances of religious violence, they're less likely to escalate and to grow and to spread into wider issues, more likely to be engaged constructively and managed constructively. But I also believe that intra-faith peace building is just as important as interfaith engagement. Oftentimes those who participate in interfaith projects, it's a little bit preaching to the choir. They're the ones who are already supportive of peace and pluralism, or at least they're open to it. The real need is in reaching those within faith traditions who are on the extremes, who are antagonistic towards other religious communities, or to the idea of peace. And I think reaching out to those communities is best done within religious communities. So for example, in Nigeria, where extremist Christianity has propelled some of the violence there, I think it's the Christian communities and Christian leaders that are best suited to reach out to those militancy groups and to try to convince them that there are other better ways, nonviolent ways, to address justice issues. It's in keeping with the best of the Christian tradition. Final point, religious peacebuilding must continue to develop sophisticated strategies and to better integrate with other peacebuilding sectors. I worry that much of the interfaith dialogue work over the past decade has tended not to be strategic or to be sustained. It's comprised of one-off, high-level, very visible meetings, or grassroots initiatives to build relationships that have not been accompanied by collective action to build peace. Violence often results from structural injustice. Even when dialogue is building positive relationships between communities, and I think this is important, but if it's not leading to structural changes to try to transform situations of injustice and to directly address issues that are at the heart of the conflict, then its peace-building impact is limited. And I think it can also spark some cynicism about religious leaders who are involved in these interfaith dialogues and who make declarations in support of peace and so on, but then who are not going out and actually implementing these declarations and doing the hard work to make their visions a reality. Interfaith dialogue, of course, is just one tool within religious peacebuilding. It's one element of religious peacebuilding. But then rather than approaching interfaith dialogue as the end-all of religious peacebuilding, we need to think of it as playing a role with developing coalitions and in support of more engaged action in support of peace. However, a primary challenge for faith-based efforts at peacebuilding historically is that they've received little support or recognition. Funds for peacebuilding, historically, have tended to privilege secular organizations and individuals. So too, training and network opportunities. Religious communities need greater support to design and implement projects that are strategic and sustained. We can't expect religious leaders to know how to do peacebuilding effectively. And we can't expect to sprinkle in a few religious leaders or religious groups here and there and to be able to effectively contribute to peacebuilding. So I think that the international community needs to put greater emphasis on trying to support some of these faith-based actors and to give them the tools that they need in order to really put this work into action effectively. Moreover, religious peacebuilding has tended to operate in isolation, which has weakened its impact. At the heart of conflict are myriad and complex issues, and religious actors must work in partnership with secular organizations, with governments, whose work is overlapping. Development, human rights, rule of law, and to transform all of these drivers of conflict. I think as outside actors, we can help forge these relationships between other organizations and faith-based actors and communities in order to create a more integrated approach. What makes certain religious peacebuilding initiatives successful, when they are successful, is when they think strategically about how to employ religious ideas and institutions to advance peace, directing persuasive moral arguments to cultivate communities, to cultivate commitments to holistic understandings of peace with justice, shalom, salam, positive peace. When they employ institutions effectively, integrating peace education into religious schools and religious formation of leaders, creating early warning and response networks that can operate through diffuse religious infrastructure, mobilizing communities through these networks, creating coalitions, providing education and training that shapes public opinion and behavior. When they draw on the capacity of psycho-spiritual support to provide trauma healing and to help break cycles of conflict and violence. What makes them successful is their commitment to long-term engagement and their linkages to local communities. And what makes them effective, finally, is when they operate with an understanding of their niche role within an array of secular actors working towards peace, not trying, as my colleague Scott Appleby has put it, to extrapolate spiritual wisdom and religious insight into technical expertise or political ambition. For those of us interested in strengthening religious leaders' engagement in peace building, we must bear these lessons in mind and seek to better understand religious communities from the inside and how to navigate these communities effectively to identify appropriate partners for peace building, whom we can engage with an eye towards supporting their niche role in peace building. If doing so, I have faith that religious engagement can contribute to peace, to building peace globally. Now, by the virtue of my time limit, which I'm sure I've already abused, this is sort of a cursory presentation, but I'm really looking forward to being in discussion and to hearing from the respondents so we can dig down into some of these issues a little bit more further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for giving us so many elements which we can discuss. So I look forward to hearing the responses from the panel. I've asked all the panel participants to prepare a short response, either to Susan or forwarding their own thoughts or comments on the topic of the seminar. Start with you, Ingrid.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, thanks for this initiative. It's an important seminar. I think this is a field that needs certainly development and perhaps also a reality check, as this seminar indicates. At a public meeting in February in Oslo on religion and human rights, I noted the following. Our foreign minister, a social democrat, stated that religious leaders comprise a resource that can be used by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Our former foreign minister, a Christian democrat, Knut Vollebæk, is currently the High Commissioner for National Minorities in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. He's expressed a more cautious view. I'm not so sure if resourceful is the accurate word, he said. He was referring to religious leaders in the Western Balkans, Caucasus, Central Asia, Russia. Leaders that he stated could be nationalistic, sometimes using religion to suppress others. I think his point was simple. Religious leaders are not one specific group comprising a similar set of moral value for the good of all. They are as different as, say, political leaders. Some are immediate potential resources in peace building. Others should perhaps be targeted differently. The question, in my view, is not whether or not we should, leaders of religious institutions should be involved. The question is how, and in what way, and when. There are certainly cases, I think, where religious leaders can be less relevant. But there are so many contexts where we can simply not overlook them because they matter, because many people are actually listening to them. They have authority, whether their message is peaceful or antagonistic. I would like to share just a few observations from the Western Balkans to illustrate some of the challenges and potentials that I have noted over some years observing interfaith peace initiatives. We know in post-war societies it takes a lot of courage to speak up for common values, for peace. So when religious leaders from Kosovo were invited to Oslo, I think in 2001, they were able to sign beautiful peace agreement, a plan of action. When they returned to Kosovo, the peace talks didn't quite fit the realities on the ground, so nothing happened. Well, in 2006, there was one sort of day of interreligious event, but that was the only one. Nothing before, nothing after. And the international actors were, of course, very disappointed. They put a lot of effort to push the process. But it's a long way from Oslo to Kosovo, as we know, and perhaps one could have been more patient, building relations over time before signing a peace agreement. Perhaps the time wasn't ripe. In Bosnia, we have an interreligious council established, I think, almost 15 years ago. And still the council struggled to be a convincing voice for peace in the country. They tend to go along the lines as the political leaders engage along political and ethnic division marks. That marks actually the country on the institutional level from top to the very bottom. And it took a long time for them even to gather in a proper manner that everyone actually participated. But when they did eventually, in the beginning of the 2000s, they found some common ground, but it wasn't a strong sort of commitment for peace that we saw. We saw an ability to join forces on promoting values against the secular state, sort of religious interests. One example, they were instrumental in pushing confessional religious teaching into an already ethnically divided primary school. What if they had spent their efforts building a common message to the children in schools on multi-religious values and traditions of coexistence from Bosnia before the war? What if they had promoted a multi-religious squad visiting schools around the country? This is a what if, and I don't know if it's possible, but it's a nice thought, I think. And was it ever sort of tested out? So the question is whether the results could have been different. Of course, it's up to the religious leaders themselves first and foremost. But let me point to some of the lessons learned from these years that I haven't actually monitored it. The leaders were viewed, I think, by outsiders, internationals, as a resourceful leaders, when they perhaps should have been targeted differently as a target group. I ask, and this is an open question, is there room for international actors to support sort of catharsis processes, intra-religious discussions on tough issues, dealing with sort of the shortcomings during the war on the part of the religious institutions? My feeling is that one somehow avoided these delicate issues, not only overlooked them, but actually avoided them. The people, when I discussed this or interviewed people throughout the country over a long period of time, I often hear that the role of the leaders during the war wasn't compatible with the peace message. But that could have been changed, they say, if they were able or willing to discuss the matters and give some statements on the past, openly and honest statements on the past. There were complaints about double standards. I think these are in line with what you mentioned, Susan. Beautiful speeches internationally, nationalistic rhetoric at home. That really harm the reputation and credibility of a leader, because everybody knows in a global world what's going on outside and inside the country. Did the institution, the formation of the council itself become the end rather than the mean, so to speak? That's something we can at least dwell on. Finally, if the senior leadership couldn't walk the talk, who could? I think that too little attention was paid on local religious leadership. And I would like to dwell just a minute on the latter. Involvement of local religious leaders in Bosnia, and actually in Kosovo as well, indicates a more positive potential. Several of us in the room are involved in a project on holy sites, a universal project with a pilot project being implemented in Bosnia on the protection of holy sites. Holy sites are frequently attacked throughout the country, in most cases directed towards minorities in the various parts of the country. And the the Interreligious Council and their secretariat have been engaged in a project that promotes a sort of a multi-religious immediate local response. And during the first year, we're now entering the second year, we have seen actually quite many very nice examples of responsible leadership on the part of local leaders. So the question is why we have these sort of rapid and, for us, surprisingly good results. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that local leaders are closer to the realities. They are living the conflict. They have to deal with the consequences. They are even maybe threatened by it. Perhaps the task was very, very, tangible. It was a problem that they needed to solve, and they had all interest in doing so. I think also the fact that the matters were of such a practical matter also involved the senior leaders in a different manner than just, ideas of being a promoter for peace, a moral value for peace. It's also, I just want to end with a small comment on when we're talking about sort of religious or secular peace building. I'm a little bit ambivalent to this wording, and I care for peace and not for, and I could certainly operate and cooperate with any organization. From the Nansen dialogue, we never consider ourselves as secular, but we weren't faith-based. But we have, in many occasions, and also in the example from Bosnia, cooperated very well with faith-based organizations. Maybe it's time that we are building down the fences. What is the point? It's being religious or secular or dealing adequately with religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, for following up some of the arguments and also providing us with some new material for discussion. And while you're there, you can make notes of clever questions to ask when the panel participants have made their statement. Schweib, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me back there? Yeah, first of all, thank you to PRIO for arranging this and inviting us. Thank you to Susan. I think you had a number of very good points. I mean, in many ways I could say I more or less agree with everything you say, and we could, sort of finish there, but you won't be that lucky, I guess. There are some issues here that work both ways. We talk about the symbolic value of religious leaders taking the initiative, taking the lead role, and that is important. But then at the same time, often I feel that we project too much power onto a number of these actors, where we say that we're more or less leave it to them and say that this is for you to clean up. Here's the mess, and you clean it up. And for a number of religious leaders, I also think that sometimes, and you both touched upon this, sometimes you end up being less free than is seen from the outside, because you become sort of hostage to your own rhetoric. Because you have posturing, and sometimes I think secular leadership can easier get out of a posturing situation than religious leadership can, because they often, and that's of course their own doing, they often use religious-based arguments, and then backing down becomes harder. So you sort of paint yourself more and more into a corner where a peaceful solution isn't that easy anymore. You mentioned 11th of September as a major change in the United States, and I guess all over the world. In Norway, in many ways, the cartoon crisis in the mid-2000s played the same role. I mean, of course, 11th September was important, but much of the work of the faith-based organizations was very much, targeted and looked upon and focused upon, except the dialogue. Norway has a long history of interfaith dialogue, Christian-Muslim dialogue, and that wasn't really, that was I think, more or less the only part that wasn't really in focus after 9/11. The cartoon crisis sort of changed that completely around. And then everything became about the dialogue, and dialogue became one of those words that is used so much that it more or less loses its meaning, for some people at least. I think it's also important to understand, and you mentioned this sort of in the past century, it was a perception, at least in the 60s, 70s, where religion was more or less, I won't say that people thought that it wasn't important anymore, but it wasn't at least important for fields like ministries of foreign affairs and things like that. And then you have this pendulum that swings back, and now I think more and more governments in Europe, in Norway for instance, have a deeper understanding of the need to understand the religious-based communities and how to work with them in different peace-building processes. I think there's also, when we talk about religious leaders as peace builders or not, I think the negative side of that is maybe more important, to make sure that they don't act as spoilers, because whether they have power to create peace is a debatable question, but their power to, or their ability to act as spoilers is definitively there. So if you can take that out of the equation, I think that is in many ways more important, at least in the first steps, to make sure that they don't perceive a peace process as a threat to their own positions, and as such act as spoilers. Nigeria, you talked about that, and that's a very interesting example, also because the imam and the pastor actually have been here, and we have had a Christian-Muslim student groups that have put up their movie and talked about it. So it is a story that is well known amongst many people here. But there also, sometimes I think we view conflicts too simplistically, as just being about religion, and sometimes they are, but many times they're not. Many times there are other issues or other fault lines that fall together with the religious ones, but are as important. It can be about ethnic groups, it can be about rural and urban communities, and those issues are often overlooked. And in many ways, I think they play as much a role as anything else in ensuring a peaceful solution. About engaging the youth or the grassroots, as you mentioned, and you also mentioned it, I think that is essential. Top level dialogue is important for its symbolic value, but you need grassroots dialogue to be able to create something that lasts. Also because top leadership dialogue is very vulnerable to that one person or those 2 or 3 people. If they for some reason fall away, if you don't have anything more down the line, it doesn't it can stall the whole thing. And I also think that you made a very good point about mid-level leadership, which both have the weight and have the sort of power or to be able to be a realistic partner in dialogue, and then at the same time you have people who engage with the grassroots all the time and have feelers out there and can react in a much better way than a top leadership can. Yeah, about the process in Norway, I think it is also important. I mean, that's obviously very. It doesn't really help if there is a problem, but a dialogue that is in place before things start going wrong is important, because that helps in creating a different kind of trust between people. If you have something that just comes as a reaction to a problem and reaction to outside pressure, it becomes much more vulnerable to breaking down. So engagement and dialogue when things are going right as well is as important, or if not more important, to be able to build something that can help us. And in the end, I think Ingrid, you made a very good point about dialogue being seen as a mean or a goal. I mean, if you just see that, you know, I mean, the dialogue becomes the reason why you do it, then we're really in trouble, I guess, because I mean, the dialogue has to have a reason for us. We have to go somewhere with the dialogue, and that's essential. And I think I'm way over my time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Svein.
Okay, what else is there to say after all these clever perspectives and thoughts? I will not challenge the perspectives presented, but I would like to perhaps add some other things, or other, as an historian of religion, I would like to make us think about how we define religion and tradition and religious actors and their agency, and if time permits, perhaps say something about what we as researchers should do research on, and also implication for the policy-making communities. But the first point first, I think that we have to remember both continuity and change in what constitutes what we perceive as a religious tradition. I mean, all religious traditions are locally reconstituted through time and space. Thus, belonging to one tradition does not lead to any given point of view on peace and conflict. I mean, this might be a very, very obvious point to make, but I do think that it's worth to remember, and I do think that in public debates we often forget that. And in my research, I have been particularly concerned with why and how Buddhism, with its strong emphasis on non-violence, has been associated with militarism in Asia. I mean, why do Buddhist monks defend their religion and country by reference to military means? The answer very often given in academic literature or by Buddhist communities themselves is that of a betrayal of a perceived true pacifism of the canonical texts. However, my argument is that it would be extremely arrogant to argue that Buddhist monks misinterpret their own tradition. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a non-essentialist view on religion and religious traditions, which allows for ambiguity and flexibility. Importantly, however, that does not leave religion as an entirely open category, and that's where the trouble starts, actually. But what I think is that we can look at it as a process of re-traditionalization, and that is a process where certain elements of the past are used in meaningful ways in the present. And it is against this very critical understanding of what constitutes a religious tradition that we have to understand people whom we label as religious actors. So this is the second point I wish to make. By religious actors, I refer to people who define themselves in public life in terms of religion and who draw legitimacy and authority from religion. But, as I have argued, religious traditions are ambiguous and in flux and may thus shape religious actors in manifold ways. Consequently, there is a great internal variety and competition among and between religious actors adhering to the same religious tradition. This opens up for religious outbidding vis-à-vis state actors and politicians. In Sri Lanka, for example, being against the peace process was an indicator of a strong Buddhist identity. By contrast, being supportive of the peace process would leave Buddhist monks open for allegations of not being true Buddhists, perhaps with a secret Christian agenda. And this is a very old strategy within religious tradition, that you actually question your opponent's religious identity. This is part of the game, as it were, to be the one holding the most true religious identity. But in a country driven by conflict, and where religion has become a political language, these are serious consequences. And the monks involved in pro-peace activities were always prone to lose their constituency, as well as protection and favors from politicians. And some of the monks I interviewed even received death threats from other monks. So we can say that the agency of religious actors is determined by a variety of factors, and one of them, and the one that I wish to highlight here now, is the ways in which religious authority is being constituted. On the one hand, religious authority gives space for political and social action. But on the other hand, religious agency is also limited by the continuities of tradition. So there is this dialectic of continuities and reform. And in the Sri Lankan case, we can see that very clearly, of the debate about being political or non-political monk. And what is kind of interesting is that at some point, being against the peace process was identified as being non-political and neutral. So the point I'm trying to make is that where the line is drawn between the religious and the political varies according to context. And the funny thing is that being with a political party qualified as political and thus dirty in the Sri Lankan context, but preaching in temples about the necessity for a military solution to the Sri Lankan war was defined as apolitical and in accordance with tradition. That being said, in the Sri Lankan case, there is also a small minority of Buddhist monks who engage themselves critically in cross-community activities and other issues concerning the local common good. For example, such critically engaged monks were involved in the international campaign against landmines, freeing hostages, or using their religious authority in order to obtain information about disappeared persons in the local communities according persons defined as the ethnically or religiously other. In that regard, Buddhist monks stepped out of their formal religious institutions and partook in other sections of civil society. Thus, in the case of the Buddhist order, it is not the religious institution itself, but the religious authority of individual monks and their networks within as well as outside the monastic order that shape their role in civil society. And I've been trying to figure out a way of how to analytically conceptualize these activities at the local level, where religious actors step out of their roles and try to reach out to other communities. And I tried to come up with this term, critical civility, and I've argued for this elsewhere, but I can say a few words now. Perhaps that's a tool we can use And it denotes a certain courteous behavior in contexts in which such behavior otherwise is not expected or cannot be taken for granted. And this may prove to be a particularly important distinction to make in assessing religion's diverse roles in times of conflict. The reason is that religious actors may conform to established social rules, for example at the local village level, by only catering for what they regard as being the needs of their community, by lending their support to state-organized violence, or by other means supporting their in-group. By contrast, by the concept of critical civility, I refer to ideas and practices in which members of one group transcend the boundaries of their community to show one can rescue other civilians, or in other ways contribute to conflict transformation. So what I'm trying to get at is are those religious actors who actually put themselves at risk by going against their own tradition, particularly in conflict-ridden societies and deeply divided societies. And I don't know if I have much more time, but
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, right. And just to say something about this interreligious dialogue, because I would define interreligious dialogue within that notion of critical civility as one element of it. But we don't really know the effect of such dialogues, as some of you have already pointed out. And one, at least from the Sri Lankan experience, I would say that such meetings are very often elitist in nature. And they only serve as symbolic gestures. And moreover, they are often initiated from the outside by third-party facilitators, donor communities, or non-local religious communities, and thus they lose their legitimacy as such. And it seems that this interreligious dialogue and the peace work is at most efficient when religious actors are local and deeply dedicated to civic politics, and it kind of links up to this experience from Norway, that when you have already established a dialogue, then is there. So just a short thing on what we study. I think there is a need for local level analysis, because these, I mean, what constitutes a religious tradition, what constitute religious actors, how the conflict is linked to religion or vice versa, is all contextual. So it requires a willingness to combine knowledge of the religious traditions as such with contextual knowledge, and to do those nitty-gritty, detailed local level studies, and also a willingness by policy makers to fund such research. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm enjoying myself immensely, because it's like a basket of fruits where so many interesting debates are possible to pick. And I guess we're making it a bit hard for ourselves, because we are on that level and not doing the specific context analysis that many of you have called for. So but we have to live with that, I think, for this setting, and then but note it as a very important dimension of this kind of work. I don't know, Susan, do you want to reply briefly to this before we give?
I think to a large extent we're sort of on agreement about some fundamental things up here, and that was reflected in some of the responses. But I think where Islin ended is an important point where we need to begin the discussion always too, which is the fact that religion is always contested, and that religions are pluralistic, even within traditions. And particularly in conflict zones, there's going to be competing narratives about what it means to be a good Buddhist in Sri Lanka, a good Muslim or a good Christian in Nigeria, and so on. And that's, I think, what makes the case for some of the internal debates, and trying to facilitate and support some of the internal debates as well as the inter-religious initiatives. And so the degree to which, I mean, with the Sangha in Sri Lanka, what I often found is that it was because it was considered a sin, quote unquote, to critique the Sangha at large and to critique your brother monks within the Sangha, there was often a lot of barriers to monks making public statements that would have been in opposition to what the Sangha line or what the Mahanayakas, the head of the religious institutions, were saying. But that internally there was a lot more debate amongst the Sangha and amongst various monks with different positions, and that was an important element, very important element in debating what Buddhist teaching was on violence and the causes of suffering and the proper Buddhist response to the peace process and so on. And that work was just as important as some of those interfaith initiatives. I want to, a point that you made, Sham, about whether conflicts are religious. This is a question that often comes up in the debate in the United States. And I actually feel that at heart, no conflicts are really about religion at the end of the day, that often it's about access to political power, it's about access to resources, to land, to decision making, but that in some contexts, particularly where the conflict divide is over an identity divide, a religious divide, the religious element becomes a driver in sustaining the conflict, and so needs to play a role in reconciliation or in peace, but becomes to some degree the lens through which you then begin to address some of those root causes of conflict. So when you're bringing the religious actors together for dialogue or engagement or peace building, you can use religion as the frame of meaning from which people are interpreting their situation around them, and from which they're trying to make a moral decision about whether violence is a viable option to deal with situations of injustice, or about what it means to defend the faith, or so on. You're using that frame of meaning in order to have discussions at the end of the day about some of these specific economic issues, or questions of governance, or human rights, or so on. And that religion is a persuasive frame of meaning to begin to get at some of these issues, because religion does sort of open up these fundamental questions of justice and identity and so on. I agree entirely that having the interfaith dialogue and the training for religious communities should be sort of a preemptive action, seen as conflict prevention tools, because often when conflict breaks out in communities, religious institutions and religious actors become very preoccupied with just humanitarian assistance, with they're helping their communities survive on the day-to-day. And if there aren't already mechanisms or programs in place for doing conflict resolution, for doing interfaith dialogue and so on, it's more difficult for them to be able to sort of envision and also implement new programs in the midst of these crisis situations. But then also, of course, in terms of interfaith dialogue, you need to have the avenues in place with other religious communities prior to these conflicts breaking out, so that there are already avenues of trust and relationships of trust built to be able to reach out. And I know former Prime Minister Bakovic has spoken about with the Danish cartoons how, because there had been some connections already between Christian and Muslim leaders in Norway, it was more viable for them to come together immediately in the aftermath of that to try to manage the religious tensions and to prevent it from escalating further into violence. I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to hearing what all of you have to contribute.